The divorce papers came on a Tuesday, delivered by a man who wouldn't meet her eyes. Sarah Brennan signed them on the porch of her sister's boarding house in Copper Ridge, her hands steady even as her heart cracked open like dried earth. 28 years old, and the only thing people would remember about her was what she couldn't do. The town had already decided her story was finished. But Sarah had never been good at letting other people write her ending. She spent her first week of freedom scrubbing floors at the boarding house, grateful for the work that made her arms ache and her mind quiet. Her sister Margaret meant well, offering tea and sympathy in equal measure, but Sarah couldn't stomach either. The pitying looks from Margaret's boarders were worse than the cold dismissal she'd gotten from Thomas before he left. At least he'd been honest about it. "A man needs sons," he'd said, packing his belongings into a worn leather bag. "I can't build a future with a woman who can't give me that." The words had landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew about herself. On Saturday morning, Sarah walked to the general store for supplies, keeping her eyes forward and her chin up. The September sun beat down on Copper Ridge's main street, turning the dust into fine powder that coated everything. She could feel the stairs following her like flies. Mrs. Henderson from the church stopped mid-conversation to watch her pass. Two ranch hands outside the saloon went quiet. Sarah's fingers tightened on her basket handle, but she didn't let her pace falter. Inside the store, she was reaching for a bag of flour when she heard the chaos. "Danny, I told you to hold your brother's hand. Emma, get down from there right now. Where's... No, Lily, you cannot have penny candy before noon." Sarah turned to see a tall man in dusty work clothes trying to corral what appeared to be an entire schoolhouse worth of children. A boy of about 10 was chasing a younger girl around the pickle barrel. Twin boys, maybe 6 years old, were attempting to climb opposite shelves, and a little girl with blonde braids was making a determined dash for the candy jars while her father's back was turned. The man ran his hand through dark hair streaked with early gray and looked like he might sit down right there on the floor and surrender. Sarah didn't think, she just moved. In 3 quick steps, she intercepted the little girl heading for the candy. "Hold on there, sweetheart. Let's help your papa first, then we'll see about treats." The girl looked up at her with wide hazel eyes. "Hooray you." "I'm Sarah, what's your name?" "Lily, I'm 5, those Ray my brothers being loud." She pointed accusingly at the boys. Sarah bit back a smile and turned to face the scene. The man had managed to separate the 2 oldest children, but the twins were now engaged in some kind of competition involving who could stack more cans of beans. "Gentlemen," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd helped raise younger siblings. "The cans need to stay on the shelf, not in a tower. House rules." The twins froze and looked at her with identical guilty expressions. "You heard the lady," their father said, seizing the moment. "Stack them back, neat now like your mama taught you." The mention of their mother created a brief silence. The children moved to obey, their small faces suddenly serious. Sarah felt the weight of that silence, understood it in her bones. These were children who knew loss. The man walked over to her, Lily's hand now firmly in his. Up close, Sarah could see the tiredness around his eyes, the worry lines that suggested he carried more than just the physical weight of ranch work. He was probably 35, maybe 40, with strong shoulders and calloused hands that had seen hard labor. "I'm grateful," he said, his voice rough as creek stones. "They're good kids, but taking all 5 to town is like trying to herd cats uphill." "5, Sarah glanced around, counting. "I only see 4. His jaw tightened. "My oldest, Ruth, she's 13, refused to come today, said she's old enough to stay home and watch the place." He shook his head. "She's old enough to be angry at the whole world, more like." Sarah recognized that kind of anger, the kind that grew in the spaces grief left behind. "How long?" she asked quietly. He understood the question. 2 years last spring. Fever took my Anna fast. Didn't even get to say proper goodbyes." His eyes met hers, and she saw something there that matched the ache in her own chest, the loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who need you but can't quite reach you. "I'm James Colter. We run a cattle ranch about 8 miles north of here." "Sarah Brennan." She didn't offer more, but the recognition flickered across his face anyway. Small towns were efficient with gossip. Brennan, your Tom Brennan's, he caught himself, cleared his throat. I heard about that, I'm sorry. The kindness in his voice almost undid her. She blinked hard and focused on Lily, who was tugging at her father's sleeve. Papa, can we go now? I'm hungry. In a minute, honey. James looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. You looking for work by any chance? I know that's forward, but I'm desperate. The kids need someone during the day while I'm working the ranch. Someone to cook, keep the house, make sure they don't kill each other. My neighbor's been helping where she can, but she's got her own family to mind. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. Getting tangled up in someone else's complicated life seemed like the last thing she needed. But then she looked at the four young faces watching their father with a mixture of hope and exhaustion, and she thought about the empty days stretching ahead of her at Margaret's boarding house. I can cook, she heard herself say, and I'm good with children. The relief that washed over James Colter's face was almost painful to witness. The pay isn't much, but it's honest. Room and board if you want it. We've got a spare room off the kitchen. If not, I can bring you back to town each evening. Taking room and board would mean leaving Margaret's, stepping fully into this new uncertain life. Sarah felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. Then little Lily smiled up at her, gap-toothed and trusting, and Sarah made her choice. I'll take the room. When do I start? Tomorrow, too soon. Tomorrow's fine. They finished their shopping in a kind of cautious partnership, James wrestling supplies while Sarah kept the children corralled. The twins, she learned, were Jack and Sam, impossible to tell apart except that Sam had a small scar on his chin from falling out of a tree. Danny was 10 and serious, already trying to carry himself like a man. Emma was 8 and quiet, watching Sarah with careful eyes that missed nothing. As they loaded supplies into James's wagon outside, Sarah caught Mrs. Henderson staring from across the street, her mouth pursed in disapproval. The message was clear. A divorced woman moving onto a widower's ranch was scandal in the making, never mind that it was honest work. James must have noticed too. People talk, he said quietly, securing the last of the supplies. I can't promise this won't make things harder for you. Sarah climbed up onto the wagon seat, her decision made and her spine straight. Let them talk. I've got nothing left to lose. But as the wagon pulled away from Copper Ridge and headed north into open country, Sarah wondered if that was true. Maybe you always had something left to lose, right up until the moment you stopped trying. The Colter Ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, a weathered two-story house, a large barn, and several outbuildings spread across a valley of good grazing land. Cattle dotted the fields like brown and white stones. It was humble but well kept, the kind of place built by hard work and maintained by necessity. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest at the sight. This was real. This was solid. The children piled out of the wagon with renewed energy, racing toward the house. James helped Sarah down, his hand warm and steady on her arm. I should warn you about Ruth, he said. She's not going to like this. She's been trying to manage the house since her mother died, and she'll see you as competition. I'm not here to replace anyone, Sarah said firmly. I'm here to help. I know that, but 13-year-old girls who have lost their mothers don't always see things clear. He wasn't wrong. When they entered the kitchen, Sarah found a thin girl with dark hair and her father's strong jaw standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like burnt beans. Ruth turned, took one look at Sarah, and her expression shuttered closed. Who's this? This is Miss Sarah. She's going to be helping out around here, cooking and watching you kids while I work. James's voice was gentle but firm. We don't need help. I can manage. Sarah looked at the burnt beans, the pile of unwashed dishes in the basin, the flour spilled across the counter, the exhaustion in Ruth's young face. I'm sure you've been doing your best, Sarah said carefully, but maybe you'd like some help so you can do other things a girl your age should be doing. I'm not a child. I can see that. You've been holding this family together. That takes strength. Sarah met Ruth's eyes steadily, but you don't have to carry it all alone anymore. Something flickered across Ruth's face, relief, maybe, or resentment, or both. She turned back to her burnt beans without answering. James gave Sarah an apologetic look and went to show her the spare room. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the barn. Sarah set down her traveling bag and sat on the bed, the springs creaking under her weight. Through the thin walls, she could hear the children arguing about something, James's patient voice trying to mediate. This was her life now. This chaos, this noise, this family that wasn't hers but needed her anyway. She pressed her hand to her stomach, to the empty space that had defined her for so long, and let herself feel the grief fresh and sharp. Then she stood up, smoothed her skirt, and went to start dinner. The first weeks were harder than she'd expected. The physical work was familiar, cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, but navigating the emotional landscape of the Colter family was like crossing a river in the dark. The younger children accepted her quickly, grateful for regular meals and clean clothes, and someone who noticed when they were hurt or scared. Danny tested her boundaries with small rebellions. The twins got into everything. Emma watched and waited, holding back some part of herself. Ruth was the hardest. She fought Sarah on everything from how to make biscuits to when bedtime should be, turning every interaction into a battle for territory. Sarah bit her tongue and tried patience, but some days she wanted to shake the girl and tell her that pushing away everyone who tried to help would only leave her alone. James worked sunrise to sunset, managing the ranch with the help of 2 hired hands who came during the day. He was quiet and steady, the kind of man who showed affection through action rather than words. Sarah watched him with his children, the way he let Lily climb into his lap after dinner, how he listened seriously to Danny's questions about cattle breeding, his patience with Jack and Sam's endless energy. He was bone-tired every night, but he never snapped at them. Never made them feel like burdens. Sarah found herself noticing other things too, the way James's eyes crinkled when he smiled, which was rare but genuine, how his hands were always gentle, whether he was mending a fence or braiding Lily's hair, the careful way he asked her opinion about things, treating her like a partner rather than hired help. She tried not to notice these things, tried not to let warmth bloom in her chest when he thanked her for dinner or when their hands accidentally touched passing dishes. She was there to work, nothing more. But late October brought a cold snap and an outbreak of influenza that swept through the valley like wildfire. First Sam got sick, then Jack, then Emma. Sarah spent 3 days barely sleeping, moving between fevered children with cool cloths and willow bark tea, monitoring their breathing and praying the fever would break. James helped when he could, but the ranch work couldn't stop, and Sarah waved him away. "I've nursed sick children before," she told him. "Go take care of the cattle." On the 4th night, when Emma's fever finally broke and Sarah was certain they'd all pull through, she sat down at the kitchen table and let herself cry. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming relief and exhaustion and the strange realization that she'd been terrified of losing these children who weren't even hers. "Sarah." She looked up to find James standing in the doorway, still in his work clothes, concern written across his face. "They're fine," she said quickly, wiping at her eyes. "They're all sleeping. The fever broke." He crossed the room and did something unexpected. He pulled out the chair next to her and sat down, then reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm, and Sarah felt the touch all the way through her body. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't know what we would have done without you here." "It's what you pay me for." "No," his grip tightened slightly. "It's more than that, and you know it. You care about them. They're not just a job to you." Sarah looked at their joined hands, at the way her smaller fingers fit against his calloused ones. She should pull away. This was dangerous territory. Letting herself feel things she had no right to feel. "I should go to bed," she said, but she didn't move. "My wife," James said suddenly, "Anna, she would have liked you. She always said the measure of a person was how they treated children who weren't their own." He paused, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that might have been unconscious. "I think you would have liked her too." The mention of his dead wife should have broken the moment, but somehow it deepened it instead. Sarah understood that he was offering her something important, acknowledgement that she belonged in this space, even with Anna's memory still present. "Tell me about her," Sarah said. So he did. He talked about Anna's laugh, about how she sang while she cooked, and how she never let him wallow in bad moods. about how she wanted more children, but the fever took her before they could have another. He talked until his voice grew rough and the moon shifted in the sky, and Sarah listened without interrupting, holding his hand and letting him grieve. When he finally stood to go to bed, he looked at her with something raw and honest in his expression. "I'm glad you're here, Sarah, not just for the children, for me too." After he left, Sarah sat in the dark kitchen and let herself admit the truth. She was falling for James Colter, falling for his quiet strength and his gentleness and the way he carried his grief without letting it make him bitter, falling for the life they were building together even though she had no right to any of it. She was barren, she couldn't give him more children, she couldn't be what a man like him needed for a future. But God help her, she wanted to try. November brought the first serious snow, and with it, trouble from town. Sarah was hanging laundry when Margaret arrived in a borrowed wagon, her face tight with worry. "Sarah, people are talking. Mrs. Henderson is organizing a group to come speak with you about the propriety of your situation here." Sarah's hands stilled on the wet sheet. "My situation. You unmarried, living on a ranch with a widower. They're calling it shameful. They think you should either leave or—" Margaret trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Or what?" "Or marry him, I suppose. Make it respectable." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "And if we did marry, I'm divorced, Margaret. I'm barren. Half the town thinks I'm cursed, and the other half thinks I'm getting what I deserve. James Colter doesn't need that kind of trouble attached to his name." "Do you love him?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked at her sister, at the kindness and concern in her eyes, and couldn't find it in herself to lie. "It doesn't matter what I feel. He deserves better than a broken woman who can't give him the family he needs." "Have you asked him what he needs? Or are you deciding for him?" Margaret's voice was gentle but pointed. "Sarah, you've spent so long letting other people define your worth. Maybe it's time you let someone see you as more than what you can't do." After Margaret left, Sarah stood in the cold wind and thought about worth, about how Thomas had measured her by her womb and found her lacking, about how the town had written her off as a failure, about how she'd started to believe them, to shrink herself down to fit their narrow definitions. But the Colter children didn't care that she couldn't have Barbies. They cared that she made good biscuits and told interesting stories and noticed when they were sad. James didn't look at her like she was broken. He looked at her like she was capable and strong and necessary. Maybe that was worth fighting for. That evening, after the children were in bed, Sarah found James mending tack in the barn. The lamplight caught the planes of his face, making him look younger and more vulnerable than usual. He glanced up when she entered, and something in her expression made him set down his work. "Margaret came by today," Sarah said without preamble. "People in town are talking about us, about me being here." James's jaw tightened. "Let them talk. It could hurt you, hurt your children. Ruth already resents me if people start saying things, making assumptions." "What kind of assumptions?" But his tone said he already knew. "That Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, "that this arrangement is improper, that I should leave or we should marry." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I don't want to bring shame on your family, James." He stood up slowly, setting aside the bridle he'd been working on. When he spoke, his voice was low and serious. "Sarah, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honest. Do you want to leave?" "No," the word came out before she could stop it. "No, I don't want to leave." "Then don't." He took a step closer, and Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. "I don't care what the town says. You belong here. The children need you. I need—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with something, then continued in a rush. "I need you to understand that this stopped being just about hiring help months ago. For me, anyway." Sarah's breath caught. "James, I know I've got no right asking for more. I'm a widower with 5 children and a ranch that barely turns a profit. You could find better. Hell, you deserve better. But if there's any chance you might feel the same way I do, I'm asking you to stay, not as hired help. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sure and warm. "As my partner. As someone I'm courting properly if you'll let me." Everything Sarah had convinced herself was impossible suddenly felt within reach, but the old fear rose up, choking her. "I can't give you more children," she said, the words jagged in her throat. "Thomas left me because of it, and he was right too. A man needs." "Stop," James's voice was sharp enough to cut through her spiral. "I'm not Thomas. I don't need more children, Sarah. I have 5 kids who already love you. What I need is someone who sees them as more than obligations. Someone who makes this house feel like a home again. Someone who makes me want to come in from the fields instead of working until I'm too tired to think." His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I need you, just you." "That's enough. You're enough." The words broke something open in Sarah's chest. Years of feeling insufficient, of measuring herself against an impossible standard, and coming up short, cracked, and crumbled under the weight of James's simple declaration. She was enough, just as she was, broken pieces and all. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too." His smile was crooked, vulnerable. "I loved Anna with everything I had, and when she died, I thought that was it for me. Then you walked into that general store and corralled my children like you'd been doing it your whole life, and something in me woke back up. It scared the hell out of me." "What are we doing?" "James, I think we're giving each other a second chance." He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious. Sarah leaned into him, and let herself believe that maybe she could have this. Maybe she could build a life on something other than what she lacked. Maybe love could grow in unexpected soil. When they pulled apart, James rested his forehead against hers. "The town can talk all they want, but if you're willing, I'd like to do this right, court you properly, and when you're ready, if you're ready, I'd like to marry you, make this official." "What about Ruth?" Sarah asked, because the girl's approval mattered, even if Ruth didn't know it yet. "Ruth's scared of losing me like she lost her mother. She thinks if she pushes you away, it'll hurt less when you eventually leave. We'll have to show her that you're not going anywhere, that we're building something permanent here." Sarah thought about the angry 13-year-old girl who'd been forced to grow up too fast. That might take a while. "Good thing I'm patient." James pulled back to look at her fully, his eyes warm in the lamplight. "So what do you say, Sarah Brennan? Will you let a cowboy with too many kids and not enough sense court you?" Sarah laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "I think I'd like that." They stayed in the barn talking until the lamp burned low, making plans and sharing hopes and building a foundation for something new. When they finally walked back to the house together, Sarah felt different, lighter, like she'd been carrying a weight for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The next morning, Ruth came down to breakfast and found Sarah making pancakes while humming. The girl stopped in the doorway, her expression suspicious. "You're happy." "I am," Sarah said simply. "Why?" Sarah flipped a pancake and considered her answer. "Because I finally stopped letting other people tell me what I'm worth." Ruth was quiet for a moment, then moved to set the table without being asked. It was a small gesture, but Sarah recognized it for what it was, a tentative offer of truce. She caught James's eye across the kitchen and saw hope there, bright as morning sun. When Margaret's prediction came true, and Mrs. Henderson arrived a week later with 2 other church women to lecture Sarah about propriety, they found her on the porch with Lily and Emma, teaching them to shell peas. James was there too, his hand resting casually on the porch railing near Sarah's shoulder, close enough to be clearly protective. "Mrs. Henderson," James said before the woman could launch into her prepared speech, "I'm glad you came by, saves me a trip to town. I wanted to let folks know that Miss Sarah has agreed to marry me. We'll be having the ceremony next month, and you're all invited to the service, of course." Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "Well, that's very sudden." "Not really," Sarah said, meeting the woman's eyes steadily. "Sometimes you just know when something's right, and this is right." After they left, Sarah turned to James. "Next month." "Too soon," he grinned at her, looking younger and lighter than she'd ever seen him. "I figured if we're doing this, might as well not wait around." "What if I'm not ready?" "Then we wait." His expression softened. But Sarah, I've watched you become part of this family over the past months. You're already ready, you just have to believe it. The wedding took place on a cold December morning at the small church in Copper Ridge. Margaret stood up with Sarah, tears streaming down her face. Danny and Ruth stood with James, Ruth looking solemn and grown-up in her Sunday dress. The younger children sat in the front pew, Lily barely able to contain her excitement. Sarah wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself and carried wildflowers that Emma had insisted on picking despite the frozen ground. As she walked down the aisle toward James, she thought about all the paths that had led here. The pain of her first marriage, the shame of divorce, the long months of believing she had no value. But James looked at her like she hung the moon, and the children smiled at her with love and trust, and Sarah realized that family wasn't about blood or biology. It was about showing up, about choosing each other day after day in the small moments and the big ones. When the pastor asked if she took James to be her husband, Sarah's "I do" rang out clear and strong. No hesitation, no doubt. That night, after the children were finally asleep and the small celebration was over, Sarah stood at the window of the room that was now theirs, looking out at the snow-covered ranch. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Sarah thought about the women in town who pitied her, about Thomas who'd thrown her away for being broken, about all the voices that had tried to convince her she wasn't enough. Then she thought about Lily's gap-toothed smile and Sam's terrible jokes and Emma's quiet affection and Danny's trust and Ruth's grudging respect. About James's steady presence and gentle hands and the way he loved her not despite her scars, but including them. "Not a single one," she said. Outside, the snow fell soft and silent over the Colter ranch, covering everything in white, fresh and clean and full of possibility. Sarah leaned back into her husband's warmth and let herself believe in second chances, in new beginnings, in the radical idea that sometimes the family you build is stronger than the one you thought you needed. And in the morning, there would be breakfast to make and children to wrangle and a life to live, imperfect and chaotic and absolutely beautiful. Sarah had been rejected for being barren, but she'd been chosen for being herself. And that, she was learning, made all the difference. The wind rattled the windowpanes and carried the faint sound of cattle lowing in the distance. James tightened his arms around her, and Sarah closed her eyes, finally at peace. She hadn't needed to change who she was. She'd needed to find the people who saw her clearly and loved her anyway. And here, in this humble ranch house with this patchwork family, she'd found exactly that. The rest would come day by day, the small victories and inevitable struggles, the growing pains and hard seasons. But they'd face it together, Sarah and James, and 5 children who needed them both. Not a perfect family, but a real one. And that was more than enough.